A few hours after Jeffrey's execution, and only a few miles away, Ian was working to gather a source to restock the lab's DNA stores. He'd travel far to find good specimens, but he'd only found signs of raptors in a forest not too far from the border of the Patriots' territory and of the United Communities' territory. Ian now dragged the specimen he'd netted down back towards his wagon, having managed to capture a variant animal for both further research and DNA restocking. It was an adult female Dakota raptor. She had struggled in the net, but gave up after realizing she'd only managed to tangle herself inside it more. As Ian continued to drag her, she snarled towards Ian and requested to be let go. Ian wouldn't dignify the dinosaur with an answer. He just put all his focus into dragging the unbelievably heavy animal towards his waiting wagon. His horses snorted nervously as they smelled the dinosaur nearing, but they stood still, not bolting. "Listen up," Ian spat at the raptor. "When we get to my wagon, you're going to cooperate and help me get you inside. If you don't, I'll just shoot you and harvest some genetic samples here. Work with me and climb in by yourself, and you stay alive." The raptor didn't answer. She only hissed and bared her teeth at him. As he neared his wagon, he heard something approaching. Hoping to gather yet another specimen, Ian looked up and saw the source of the noise. He realized that he had been the one who was being hunted the entire time. Dylan traveled down into the subterranean tunnels for the last time. He would not be allowed down here after his reassignment went into effect. He wouldn't miss the tunnels, the dim lights, or the mold. He would miss Shadow. Dylan had spent the whole day trying to think of a way to get Shadow out, but he couldn't come up with anything practical for slipping the dinosaur out of the city. Even though he did have a few ideas for getting Shadow above ground, he couldn't think of how to get him out of that cell. Shadow would not fit through the iron door, and Dylan didn't know how the bars opened. He knew there had to be a way, since Shadow mentioned a few occasions he remembered being tranquilized, muzzled, restrained, and wheeled into a laboratory. Those were the only glimpses of anything outside of here I've ever had, that I can remember. He was the only person in the tunnels on this night, and as he walked along, he looked into the empty cages. He imagined what horrors might have resided here if the United Communities had not won the war. How many shadows would there have been? Each cage would either have contained a captured talking dinosaur or more hybrids, each hybrid deadlier than the one that preceded them. Thankfully, that reality had never come to pass. He approached the only cage with an occupant, hopefully the only one that would ever have an occupant, and stopped. He had no idea what he was going to say to Shadow. He couldn't say nothing, but he didn't know how he could break the news to him. He took a deep breath and walked the rest of the way to Shadow's cell. Shadow sat up at the sight of his friend. He was always excited to see Dylan, the only human to treat him with kindness and friendship instead of sadistic pain. And the only human I've eaten and spat up and still wants to be friends. He couldn't help but think, softly chuckling, though his insides did still hurt something awful. Still, it only took a moment for Shadow to sense that something was wrong with Dylan. Those glowing green eyes never missed anything. "What's wrong?" he asked as Dylan entered his cell. "Nothing good," Dylan replied. "What?" Shadow asked nervously. "I've been reassigned. I can't come down here anymore after tonight," Dylan sighed. Shadow stared at Dylan, not moving. "Why?" he asked softly. "I can't come back. But, Shadow, I can't come back. I would if I could, but..." He was cut off as Shadow leapt off the ground, forcefully tackling him to the cell floor, snarling softly. Even with his head spinning, Dylan could tell Shadow wasn't playing, but was instead in a fit of blind fury. "You... tease," Shadow managed to hiss. A mixed bag of emotions hitting him all at once. What is happening here, he thought to himself. I shouldn't be doing this. But it was like something else was in control of his body. It hit Dylan like a ton of bricks that Shadow was in a blind rage. That's all you've been doing? Winding me up? You think that it's funny to shatter the only good thing in my life? Shadow snarled and raised his claws in a threatening pose. At the last second, he slammed them into the concrete next to Dylan's head, cracking the cell floor. It all happened so fast, Dylan couldn't find his voice. Shaking from rage, the hybrid climbed off Dylan, who was also shaking and too stunned to move. Leave, Shadow hissed, turning and slinking into the darkest part of his cell. He was shaking, he was so angry. Dylan was the only good thing in his life, and now Dylan had been ripped away from him. It was so unfair. Shadow didn't know if he could keep his emotions in check for much longer. Whatever had seized control of him a moment ago was close to doing so again. Dylan sat up after Shadow flopped down in the darkest corner of his cell. Shadow, it wasn't my idea. I would never have become your friend just to tear it away for a laugh. And I know what you just did wasn't you. You have so much built up rage inside of you that the slightest thing can set it off. That isn't your fault. I should have thought of a better way to break the news to you. If you really believed that I was just building you up to break your heart, then you wouldn't have missed my skull a minute ago, Dylan said. He slowly stood up and cautiously walked toward Shadow. I don't want to leave. I really don't. And to prove it to you, he stopped in the center of his cell, arms stretched out wide to either side. If I were building you up, I wouldn't do this. If you want to kill me, come at me and take it out on me. I won't stop you. Shadow slowly lifted his head and stood, walking over to Dylan on all fours. I'm sorry. I'd never hurt you. I don't know what happened to me back there. Shadow softly said, nuzzling Dylan's head with his nose. He sounded frightened of himself. Dylan reached up and stroked Shadow's bottom jaw. I know. Everyone gets angry and blows up from time to time. You have so much anger pent up inside that it just exploded. That isn't you. It's them. I don't think I can be alone anymore, Shadow whimpered. Please, please, don't leave, he begged. Dylan hugged Shadow's neck, saying, I'm sorry, but they won't even allow me down here again after tonight. You shouldn't have to be here either, but we've all been dealt losing hands. Let's try to make the best of this time we have right now. Shadow tightened his grip on his friend. Dylan was the only good thing that Shadow had ever known since his brother's death. And in that moment, Shadow never wanted to let him go. Dylan reflected on all of that as he began another shift of guard duty on the inhabited section of the city's outer defensive wall. Dylan's shift for guard duty began after night fell. The city was cast into darkness. The only light to see was the occasional flickering fire pit blaze being used to illuminate the streets. A rule that had been enacted post-war was that electric lights were to be kept at a minimum at night. In Dylan's opinion, guard duty was the most mundane job possible. He sighed, pretending to look at the dark forest that began not far from his section of the wall. Watch the trees for a few hours, maybe point a gun at something that turned out to be a squirrel. That was his job. Very useful. As he stared into the darkness, his mind began wandering, and it very quickly went back to Shadow. Dylan missed him, and wished there was something he could do to get Shadow out of his prison. But even if there was an option, the second he got near that place again, he'd probably be arrested for not being at his post. When his replacement arrived, Dylan was very happy to get off the wall and get some sleep. Shadow also thought about Dylan as the hours slowly passed. His first and only friend was gone, and he'd probably never see him again. The days since Dylan had been reassigned had been some of the worst for Shadow. He'd gotten a taste of friendship, and now it was gone. At least before he'd met Dylan, he didn't know what he was missing. Not knowing was bliss compared to what he felt now. He'd been trying to sleep when the familiar pain of electrocution shot through his body again, zapping him from concealed wiring within the cell floor. Once it passed, Shadow looked up and snarled. There was Miller, standing outside of the cell bars, a smirk on his face and a remote in his hand. He said, "Wake up, version 1. No sleep for you tonight." He sent another wave of electricity into Shadow. Not lethal, but it hurt. It hurt a lot. After 5 minutes of this torture, Shadow finally reached his limit and roared, shrieking like a deranged animal, and flung himself at Miller with jaws agape, wanting nothing more than to rip him into 100 pieces with his claws. Flying out of the dark section of his cell, shrieking, he collided with the bars and stuck his arms through them, clawing at the man who was just out of reach. Miller took a step back and chuckled. "Ho, you're scary." The sarcasm radiating off him was only topped by his smugness, and he hit the button once more. Shadow snarled, taking a step back. Every time he planted a foot on the floor, pain surged through his leg. Shaking as his anger, his pure fury grew to unprecedented levels with every electrified jolt of pain. It grew, and eventually he could hold it back no longer. Shadow had seen red before, 1,000 times. But what he saw in that moment was not red. It was something fiery and volatile. It gave him a surge unlike anything he'd had before. And even though he'd done it 1,000 times before, Shadow again threw himself at the bars, flying into them with full force and pressing his entire body weight against them as he rammed into them. Whether it was some kind of divine intervention, his rage adding that extra amount of power to the strike, or just the structure finally giving in from lack of maintenance, Shadow suddenly felt himself fall forward. When he opened his eyes, he was on the ground in the corridor outside of his cell. The bars had fallen under his weight. "Oh shit," Miller said, dropping the remote. He sprinted down the tunnel, as Shadow just lay there where he was, stunned. It hadn't fully hit him that he was free of his cell, and that he had a chance to escape. Slowly, he climbed back onto his feet, looking down the tunnels in both directions, and then back into his cell once again. Distant shouting made him react, and, after glancing around again, he felt a wave of fresh strength. Shadow took off and turned down a pitch-black narrow side passage, not making a sound, and vanishing, leaving his empty cell behind. Dylan's living area was nothing special. A tiny room. Crammed inside were cabinets, a sink and toilet, a bed, and a counter with a broken, sad coffee maker on it that had been sitting there for at least a decade. Probably 2. He flopped down onto his bed and just looked up at the dirty ceiling. The sudden sound of alarms coming from down the road, audible through his open window, made him sit back up. He went out onto his small balcony and realized where it was coming from. Something, or someone, had triggered the alarms inside the building that housed the labs. Knowing the cat would be out of the bag before morning, Miller decided to sound a warning to the people in the labs above and the others scattered around who would know what it meant. It was time to begin plans to clear out or make up a damn good cover story. With any luck, things could still go as planned, But version 2 hadn't yet developed fully. The synthetic bag his embryo was rapidly developing in would need to stay in place for at least another full day, maybe 2, before he'd hatch. Preemptive or not, we gotta do it now, Miller said to himself, pulling an old alarm trigger mounted to the wall. After pulling the old fire alarm, Miller continued running down the tunnels. The yellow lights, the leaky, rusted pipes on the ceiling, and the occasional panels of switches and fuses bolted to the walls were his only companions. His destination was the nearest staircase that led up to the labs, where he could help with the evacuation preparations. That way, when version 2 hatched, they could leave right away. If they'd developed version 2 with a real egg, like version 3, they could have left that night. But the scientists had insisted on a synthetic one that would develop his embryo to maturity much faster. Unfortunately, it couldn't be moved. "Stop!" a voice shouted. Miller paused and turned, seeing 2 recruits running up behind him. They were Dylan's replacements. They'd stopped about 20 feet from him, while he stood in a 4-way, pitch-dark tunnels on each side. Thankfully, with no sign of glowing eyes. He had no idea where the hybrid was, but he didn't think it was close. He looked back at the 2 recruits and bit his lip. He had 3 possible escape routes if talking proved fruitless. "Why did you pull the alarm?" one of the recruits asked. "And what the hell are you doing down here? No one is supposed to be on this floor but us," the second added. Miller paused for a moment, deciding if he should lie. "Talk!" one of the soldiers shouted, raising his gun. Miller snapped as soon as he heard their tone and saw the soldier's reaction to his silence. "It's loose. You can't tell me you didn't see it on your past patrols," Miller shouted. "We didn't see anything. What's loose?" one of the young soldiers replied. "Oh. It must have hidden itself. But surely the colonel told you what you were doing down here when he assigned you to this post, right? He's in on it. Surely he must have at least given you a hint. That young recruit from before didn't turn out right, so he had him replaced with you 2. See if you would be more into what we're doing in these labs. More curious, more inclined to ask questions and learn the truth. But if you never even saw the seed waiting down here to spark those questions, then it was all a waste of time." The first of the recruits now also raised his gun. "See if we'd be into what? Learn what truth? What did you see down here?" Miller scoffed and spread his arms wide in dramatic fashion. "The future! The plan to take back what's ours? Now with Ian missing, Jeffrey unexpectedly removed from the equation, and Tim dead in some dinosaur's stomach somewhere, I'm in charge! We have built the first true weapon of the new world. It's art. A dinosaur we created, built to be a weapon, and it got loose. But we'll make more. We have made more. And we will become what we used to be. We few. The true patriots. Who will restore everything back to how it should be. Our days of being covert are just about over," Miller explained. At that moment, a black shape shot out of the tunnel to his left and carried Miller off in its jaws down the tunnel to the right. It was gone less than a second after it appeared, vanishing into the opposite tunnel from which it had emerged. The 2 recruits didn't get a good look. They only saw a black blur. They just stared, wide-eyed at the spot for a few seconds, rooted in their places. "Go, go, 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 run!" one of the guards yelled. They turned and ran, hoping that the monster would stay in the darkness and not follow them. All they heard behind them was Miller screaming. Shadow enjoyed every single second of letting the man in the suit feel his pain. He slowly cut into him with his claws. He stabbed Miller's legs with his raptor sickle claws, snapped bones with powerful bites, and even sliced off what a man really values, his testicles, with just one smooth cut from the digit claws on his fingers. He didn't touch Miller's eyes, though. He wanted his tormentor to see everything that was happening to him, and Shadow also wanted his glowing eyes to be the last sight Miller ever saw. In the dark tunnel, Shadow's revenge went on for almost 30 full minutes, and he made sure Miller was alive for the duration. When he was satisfied, Shadow cut the man's belly open and pulled Miller's intestines out, and then he left him there, choking, to die alone in the darkness. An autopsy would later be done on Miller's body after it was found, and it would show the true extent of the damage done to him. It was even so shocking to everyone at the time that it was preserved and filed away in a safe location, and by luck survived the following years of turmoil. Eventually, by chance, it was rediscovered 84 years later and brought, with other surviving documents from the same period, to the capital of the Coalition and properly archived. From there, it was preserved as an historical document, and it survives to this day. We intend to eventually compile it into a future work with some of the other surviving texts we sourced for this narrative. With his revenge completed, Shadow now could focus on finding a way out. Keeping quiet, he went from hall to hall. He didn't see any other people, but knew that the two he glimpsed while carrying off Miller would have reported him by now. What their response would be, he didn't know, but didn't want to be around in case a bunch of people came hunting for him. Finally, he found a way out. A staircase. The steps went up, and Shadow broke through the door at the top. When the door burst open, Shadow stepped through, exiting a side door set into a brick building, and walked out onto a street. His first ever step outside. He stood under a security light and gazed around. It was night out on the street, and there was fresh air, too. Shadow had never smelled fresh air before. It was clean, and it wasn't damp, unlike the stagnant air in the tunnels. The fresh, cool night air was the most wonderful thing he had ever smelled, and Shadow took several deep breaths. He was outside. It didn't seem real. Shadow remained frozen to the spot and just looked around with his jaws slightly parted in astonishment. He gazed about in awe and with childlike wonder. He'd never seen the outside, nor had he ever seen anything so big, so expansive. Shadow's first look upon the night sky was such a profound moment that it was even depicted in a painting by one of the United Coalition's most famed artists some 200 years ago. It still hangs in the Capitol to this day, alongside other murals of some of the individuals you've read about. Going back to that long ago night, Shadow spent more time than he realized just looking at the buildings and the sky, taking in just how big everything outside was. It wasn't until he heard shouting in the distance from another street that he snapped out of it and knew that he needed to move. He was not interested in having to fight his way out of the city. So, still being quiet, Shadow sprinted across the street, climbed the nearest border wall to the outside, threw himself over, and was gone, vanishing like a ghost into the forest. It seems the terrorist group, the True Patriots, made more progress than we thought. They're clearly not just a group of extreme idealists or ambitious scientists as we believed. We don't know who all is in this group either, other than the colonel who has been apprehended, or how big of a threat they truly are. But we know no one in this room is one of them, hence why you are all called here. We believe that they are too few to be a true threat to us or the United Communities, but that might change as more intelligence is gathered. Now, about an hour ago, the thing they made escaped over the wall. It is a hybrid dinosaur made to be a weapon. Two of our own only got a glimpse of it. They claimed not to have seen it prior. You all must go find and kill it before it kills anyone else. Any questions? A commanding member of the Patriots military said to a group he gathered for a briefing on the situation. Sir, why can't we just let it go? Because, Fitzpatrick, the ecosystem out there has been unstable and near the point of collapse for decades. Jurassic-era life doesn't mix with life from the modern day well. It's only now just settling again into a stable situation. A new wrench in the system could be what makes it all collapse. And if the ecosystem goes, then so do we. The hunting party was given an automatic rifle each with a flashlight taped to the barrel. There were 20 people preparing to go into the woods to find the hybrid. Good hunting, their commander said once they were ready. He escorted them to the gate and saw them off himself. The pitch-dark forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals, most insects or amphibians. What sounded like a flock of pteranodons screeched and squawked into the dark sky overhead, heading towards the river, most likely to hunt for fish. It was probably the same group that was responsible for an incident from a few years back, when a group of 4 people were in a rowboat on that river, and they were swarmed by a flock of very curious pteranodons. The pteranodons left only after one of the 4 hit one of them with an oar, and had fallen into the water in the process. Amazingly, no one was hurt. The event left a footnote in the historical records of the Patriots, nonetheless. The only lights in the forest were the flashlights at the end of each gun held by the members of the hunting party. They marched in single file through the trees and brush, weapons up, scanning the forest for any sign of their target. At the very back of the group, Dylan only had his gun reluctantly half raised. They were heading towards a nearby swamp, intending to search it for the hybrid before a wider search began. It was believed the hybrid would go there first, due to both the large amount of food available and easy access to water. The troopers in the party had been told to never be without more than one person and, if separated, try to stay in twos. Suddenly, the nighttime sounds stopped, leaving a silent forest in its wake. Every soldier in the group knew that it meant it was a dangerous forest. The soldier in the lead, the only one wearing a strapped-on patrol cap, raised his fist, a silent order to stop. Everyone behind him took combat-ready positions, some standing and others crouched. Except Dylan, who had let himself fall about 5 paces behind the group. The lead soldier kept scanning the area with his flashlight when, from the bushes behind him, out swung a large tail with spikes at the end. The Thagamizers impaled him from behind and went clean through his midsection. He dropped his gun in shock, gasping as the air was pushed out of his lungs, and was then flung into one of the other soldiers when the tail swung back around. Screams began to break out, and the soldiers in the group began firing at random shadows. As some tried to reorganize, they began to be picked off one by one. Some seized in powerful jaws and carried away, others dragged screaming into the bushes. Others were slashed by sharp claws and gouged deeply, and others were bit nearly in half. Dylan saw a bush next to one of the soldiers erupt outward, and a black shape shot out of it and carried him off. Visible in the rapidly moving beams from the flashlights was a blurry dinosaur shape with 2 glowing orbs in its skull and a long spiked tail. "What the hell is that thing?" someone shouted, firing their gun in the direction that the shape had vanished, only to be tripped by the tail and then drug off quickly into the brush. His screams cut off quickly, their silence accompanied by a simultaneous snap of bone. The shape passed through the panicked soldiers again, carrying off another Patriot soldier and disemboweling the stomach of another with a passing swipe from its clawed fingers. By then, the soldiers were firing in all directions, but no one even came close to hitting the hybrid. The men only became more panicked as Shadow began to smash the lights on the dropped weapons. One soldier saw a large 3-toed foot with the claws of a large raptor slammed down on and crushed the flashlight still taped to a dropped gun. He looked up just in time to see open jaws lunging at his face. When the slaughter had started, Dylan backed up, and as it continued, he ducked back behind a tree, leaving his gun behind, and just waited for it to be over. Dylan slowly sank down onto the ground, facing away from the unfolding carnage. Soon the screams and gunshots stopped. The most the hunters had seen was a quick glimpse of the dinosaur, usually right before they were killed by it. There was just one hunter left now, spinning around in a panic, his gun raised and shaking. From out of the night, A black shape with giant claws and teeth charged him, jaws open, claws extended, and the hunter's terrified scream cut off quickly as the sounds of bones being crunched between teeth filled the air. The last light, the one on the hunter's gun, was then smashed out with a powerful stomp from Shadow's foot. The forest was now left in darkness and silence once more. Almost. Dylan could hear a sniffing sound approaching him and blurted out, "Shadow, it's me." Silence again. A few seconds later, a dark shape, darker than the forest, moved around the tree. A dark mass with two glowing green eyes. "Shadow?" Dylan asked. Shadow said nothing. He just stood there for a few seconds, totally still. Dylan gazed up at him, unaware if Shadow was going to kill him, too. He didn't think Shadow would, but he also knew how unpredictable Shadow could be in moments of blind rage. Dylan then felt two powerful hands adorned with clawed fingers seize him and lift him up off the ground. The next thing he knew, he was eye level with the dinosaur. Shadow cocked his head to the side a bit, his glowing eyes unblinking as he examined who he had picked up. For a few tense seconds, Shadow snorted and licked his lips. "I could eat you right up again and no one would ever know," he said. Then he relaxed, puffing in an amused way, and Dylan could also see the amused smirk on the dinosaur's face. "But why would I do that? Instead, I think I'm just going to give you a big hug." He pulled Dylan tightly against his chest and hugged him tight. Dylan sighed in relief and returned the hug, feeling himself beginning to laugh softly as he did. Shadow sat down on the forest floor and released his friend. "You're free," Dylan said, scooting back and sitting down. His eyes adjusted to the dark enough that he could now make out Shadow's shape. Shadow reached a hand outward and gently ran a claw down the side of Dylan's face, as if he still didn't fully believe he was there. "I missed you." "I missed you too," Dylan replied. He reached out and affectionately petted Shadow's armored nose, a feeling he hadn't realized he'd missed as much as he had. Despite what Shadow had done, Dylan found that he wasn't afraid of him at all. "What are you going to do?" Shadow asked after a few minutes. "Go back?" "No. I'm officially defecting. I say we go to one of the United Communities. They take in talking dinosaurs if they're with people. We be together and far from the Patriots." "I'd like that," Shadow said. They hugged one another again, and Shadow looked up at the sky. "I never knew what the outside was like. The air smelled and tasted like and how it feels on your skin. How the leaves and bark of trees feel under your hands. The soft ground and how it feels under your toes. I love it," Shadow said, smiling at the sky. He stared up at the stars, the awe on his face visible in their pale, far-off light. He eventually looked down and added, "Let's go. I want to get away from here," he said, standing. "The nearest community is about a day's walk straight that way," Dylan said, pointing. "But can we wait till the morning? I'm exhausted." "I'm wide awake. I'll take us. You can rest. Sleep if you feel like it," Shadow replied. "How?" Dylan asked. Shadow huffed and motioned to his back. There was enough room between his neck and sail for Dylan to sit. Dylan shrugged. "That'll work, I suppose." Shadow lowered down onto all fours and Dylan climbed up. "Hold tight. I'm gonna go at a full sprint," Shadow warned. "Okay," Dylan replied. "And Shadow? Thanks for not eating me the day we met." "Hey, what kind of friend would I be if I ate you?" Shadow replied with a laugh. Let's forget that one time, though, shall we? A friend with a little more meat on his exposed ribs is what you would have been, Dylan chuckled. And yes, please, I'd rather not keep remembering that. Your outsides are great. Your insides, not so much. Shadow laughed and lightly thrashed his passenger with a shake of his body. Don't make me throw you off, Shadow replied with a smirk. Though, I thought it was what's inside that mattered anyway. Not literally, Dylan replied, wrapping his arms around Shadow's neck. Whatever you say, Shadow said, chuckling and shaking his head. With that, he took off, running on all fours into the night. There were only a few scientists left working. Ian was still missing, Miller was dead, and Tim had vanished. That was only a cover story. After it was noticed that he was playing both sides, he had been silenced before he could squeal to anyone about the projects that were finally coming to completion. After Ian had disappeared, a fresh blood sample had been taken from 00001, and from there the scientists working on version 2 began adding on to that base. The scientists loyal to the True Patriots took what Ian had finished and then haphazardly rushed through the last steps of the process to create and grow the main hybrid they were focused on. This was exactly what Ian had said they should never do when creating a new animal. The new baby didn't have an eggshell. Instead, it was incubating in a synthetic version of one. A small, slimy, clear hanging bag made of biomatter with a large biohazard symbol printed on the side. Finally, the moment came, and a claw sliced it open. From the gash, a large amount of hazy liquid began pouring out as the new hybrid began clawing its way free. It looked almost exactly like 00001, except for the lack of a Spinosaurus sail. Instead, a row of spikes was emerging along the dunkly osseous armor-covered back. It was also a bit bulkier than its predecessor, and it was perfectly capable of walking on all fours or only on two legs. It had the teeth of the scissor-toothed shark Adestus, giving the new hybrid a truly terrifying look to it. The teeth ran in a single row along the midline of the top and bottom of the dinosaur's mouth. Similar to version 1, version 2's teeth were made to break through the armor that covered the hybrid's bodies, though most bullets couldn't. The claws were the same. Its eyes were, when compared to version 1, the same size relatively to its predecessors, but they glowed with a bioluminescent deep yellow color instead of green. Also, like version 1, there were no visible pupils to be seen. However, version 2 had thermal vision. Version 2 also had a series of quills growing out of the back of its armored head, though the ones on this version looked more like spikes than quills. On its feet were the sickle claws of a Utahraptor, and between each toe was webbing for improved swimming capabilities, plus this hybrid had gills on its neck. This allowed version 2 to be just as deadly in water as it was on land. Version 2 also possessed Stegosaurus spikes, thagamizers, on its tail. However, it carried an additional third row compared to version 1's 2 rows. Version 2 was stronger, faster, and thanks to an extremely accelerated growth rate, would be fully grown and matured in just over a week. But, thanks to the truly brilliant scientists, he was designed so that the accelerated aging would stop as soon as he reached full physical maturity. This meant he wouldn't age so fast that he died in a month. He could now be a long-term use weapon for the True Patriots. Version 3 and Version 3A would be identical once they hatched, which was expected to be soon now that their eggs were fertilized. They were incubating in real eggs because their development had not fallen behind, but to ensure Version 2 was born first, his development had to be dangerously accelerated, to the degree that the scientists could not incubate his embryo in an actual shell and hatch him naturally. Once Version 2 was fully grown, he would be unleashed upon the united communities, A truly perfect monster, deadly on land and in the water. The first step for the true patriots to take back what they lost in the war 10 years earlier was completed at last. Despite the setbacks and key members being killed, they could still pull off re-establishing the Patriots as the rulers once more. Version 2 was already providing promising results. When one of the scientists reached towards him, the little hybrid lunged forward and sunk his unique fangs into the man's finger. Blood dripping from his mouth, the surprisingly aggressive hybrid skittered back, growling threateningly. "Magnificent!" the scientist exclaimed as he examined his bleeding finger. "Less than 2 minutes old, and it has already drawn first blood." With version 1, the true patriots had tried to use pain and fear to force it into submission, but that approach had failed and only resulted in a dinosaur that refused to give them what they wanted. With version 2, they would take a different approach. Brainwashing would start immediately. They would program its impressionable, instinct-driven mind into what they desired before an individual personality could take root. They would raise it to suppress its own free will and become a programmed creature that was loyal only to them. They made him. They owned him. They would use him. He was the true patriot's sinister masterpiece. To be concluded in the published version of the Spinosaurus. The Hybrid. From the Spinosaurus, A Tale of Humans and Dinosaurs, a post-apocalyptic novel, read by the author.